Secrets the Third Reich never wanted you to know. The men who refused to kill. In the dark heart of World War II, when Nazi power seemed unshakable and dissent was often a death sentence, there existed a small but extraordinary group of men who dared to say no. They were German soldiers, officers, and police officials, men embedded deep within the machinery of the Third Reich, who defied direct orders to kill unarmed civilians, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and other targets of Nazi extermination policies. At a time when conventional wisdom among the SS, South Dakota, and police forces insisted that any command from a superior officer must be obeyed without hesitation, no matter how cruel these individuals chose conscience over obedience, the accepted belief was chillingly simple. Refusal would mean being shot on the spot, sent to a concentration camp, or placing one's family in grave danger. And yet, more than 100 cases have been documented of men who faced this moral crossroads and did not falter. Some resisted quietly, maneuvering through military bureaucracy to shield their men from taking part in executions. Others refused outright, risking their lives to protect strangers targeted for slaughter. Their actions challenge one of the most persistent myths of the Nazi era, that refusal to kill was impossible. So, what happened to those who resisted the orders of a murderous regime? Were they executed, broken in prison, or did some survive, even thrive, after standing against the tide of genocide? What follows are their stories complex, harrowing, and surprisingly varied. In the brutal hierarchy of Nazi-occupied Europe, refusal was meant to be unthinkable. Orders to execute Jews, Roma, suspected partisans, or captured Soviet soldiers were not framed as suggestions, they were absolute commands, backed by the threat of the SS, the Gestapo, and the entire Nazi security apparatus. Yet, amid this machinery of death, individual moments of moral clarity emerged. One such man was Dr. Albert Bettel, a lawyer and Army Reserve major stationed in Przemyśl in 1942. When SS units prepared to seize Jews under his jurisdiction, Bettel didn't just hesitate, he acted. Using his authority, he convinced superiors to shelter the Jews inside military barracks, placing them under Wehrmacht protection. For a time, it worked. The SS was denied access, and dozens of lives were spared, if only temporarily. Eventually, the SS reclaimed their victims, and Bettel was reprimanded and sent to the front lines. Himmler himself intended to have him arrested after the war, but Bettel evaded that fate. Years later, his bravery was recognized in Israel, standing as one of the clearest acts of open resistance to genocidal policy inside the Wehrmacht. Another case involved Bernhard Gries, a retired police major called back into service in 1939. By 1941, he was temporarily commanding police units in East Prussia when the SD requested his men to take part in a mass execution of Jews in Jorgensburg. Gries refused outright, insisting he would only act if given a direct, written order from his superior in Königsberg. While he traveled to secure this document, the SD went ahead with the massacre of 365 Jews. His refusal triggered an SS investigation, but remarkably, the case was dropped. Not only did Gries avoid punishment, he was later awarded the Iron Cross. These early examples reveal something remarkable. Despite the terror of Nazi authority, outright refusal did not always end in death. Sometimes, those who said no even received promotions. More cases of refusal and their outcomes. The summer of 1941 brought another act of defiance, this time from an Ordnungspolizei officer, faced with a direct command from SS and police leader Odilo Globoknik. The order was clear: execute Russian prisoners of war and Jews. The officer turned to his superior, Rudolf Müller-Bonich, for guidance, stating flatly, "I do not wish to participate." Müller-Bonich's answer was equally firm. The role of the Ordnungspolizei was not to serve as executioners. His superior, Major General Wilhelm Reinfarth, backed him up, ordering that in the future, the SS should be told that police units would not be used for such killings. Himmler himself was informed, and surprisingly agreed. Though Globoknik complained, the only repercussion was Reinfarth's transfer to Prague 2 months later. Neither the officer who refused nor Müller-Bonich faced further consequences. In another case before February 1942, a Schutzpolizei major, possibly Anton Perr, was ordered by an SS leader to have his battalion execute Jews. He refused unless a legal court sentence could be produced and insisted that a judge and prosecutor be present. Even when the order was repeated, he stood firm, notifying his regiment of his refusal. This stance inspired a broader order across the Schutzpolizei. They were not to be involved in executions. Sometimes resistance came from within elite SS units themselves. In 1941, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, Friedrich Dürn and Untersturmführer Schreiber refused to allow their battalion, the Reichsführer SS Begleitbataillon, to continue participating in the executions of Jews and Poles. Dürn reported his refusal directly to Berlin. A few days later, the battalion was dissolved and its companies reassigned. Though censured, Dürn continued his career and even earned promotions. And then there was Walter Entrich, transferred to Lutsk, Ukraine in April 1943. His commander, Helmut Riebstein, shared his view that any future orders for executions would be illegal. Months later, SS leader Günther tried to recruit Entrich for the liquidation of the Jews in their district. Entrich refused, labeling the task criminal. Günther attempted persuasion, but Entrich remained unmoved and suffered no consequences. These stories illustrate a startling reality. While refusal could provoke threats, investigations, or transfers, execution for disobedience was far from inevitable. In fact, survival, sometimes even professional advancement, was possible for those who resisted. The harshest case, Dr. Franz Hornig. Not every act of refusal ended without cost. One of the most severe punishments faced by any resistor came in the case of Dr. Franz Nikolaus Ernst Franz Hornig, a first lieutenant in the Wehrmacht who had once served in the police. In October 1941, Hornig was deployed east as a platoon leader. Just weeks later, on the 1st of November, he received a chilling order from his battalion commander: execute 780 Russian prisoners of war. The prisoners had been separated from Stalag 325 and were to be killed with a shot to the neck in a forest between Lublin and Lemberg. Hornig refused. His reasons were clear and deeply personal, rooted in his training as a lawyer, his Catholic faith, and his sense of duty as an officer. He gathered his men and told them plainly, shooting defenseless people was a crime, an act no better than the atrocities of the Soviet secret police. None of his soldiers took part in the killing, though they were ordered to secure the perimeter while others carried it out. Afterward, Hornig vanished from the execution site, leaving his furious commander searching in vain. His defiance led to charges not primarily for refusing the order, but for allegedly undermining the fighting spirit of his troops. In November 1942, he was sentenced to 3-4 years in prison. In March 1945, a second trial added 6-7 more years, but in both cases, the sentences were never carried out. Himmler didn't sign them. Instead, Hornig was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp, where he remained until the war's end, still holding his officer's rank and salary. Hornig's ordeal shows that while death sentences for refusal were absent in the documented cases, prison and harsh treatment were very real risks, especially for those who openly challenged the moral core of Nazi policy. The statistics, motivations, and methods of refusal. When researchers examined the records of the Ludwigsburg Central Archives, they found at least 85 documented cases of individuals ranging from enlisted soldiers to generals in the army, police, Waffen-SS, SD, and even Einsatzgruppen who refused to participate in the murder of civilians or prisoners of war. In most cases, refusal meant saving only oneself from involvement, but in at least 12 instances, officers also prevented their entire units from participating. The motivations varied. 41 individuals, nearly half, gave no specific personal reason. Over a quarter cited humanitarian or religious convictions, moral disgust, or conscience. One soldier was moved to refuse because a Jewish man in the execution lineup personally recognized him and asked him to shoot straight. About 1 in 6 considered the killings illegal and refused on legal grounds. Others argued that such acts would harm the mental well-being of their men, fell outside their military role, or violated professional ethics. A few thought the killings were politically disadvantageous. The strategies for refusal were equally diverse. Direct refusal to carry out the order, sometimes delivered formally to superiors, using bureaucratic obstacles such as demanding written orders, legal sentencing documents, or the presence of judges. Requesting transfers to avoid participation. Feigning illness, incompetence, or even insanity. Hiding during executions, or deliberately misinterpreting orders. Collective refusals by entire groups or units, even exchanging prisoners for wounded soldiers to prevent their deaths. Strikingly, no evidence was found of anyone being executed for refusing to kill civilians or prisoners. Out of the 85 cases, 49 reported no negative consequences whatsoever, and some refusers were even promoted after their acts of defiance. These statistics tear down one of the most persistent myths of the Nazi era, that disobedience meant certain death. The truth is far more nuanced and far more hopeful. The stories of these men, Dr. Albert Battel, Bernhard Griese, Rudolf Müller-Bonnig, Anton Pöhr, Friedrich Dürn, Walter Entrich, Dr. Franz Hornig, and dozens of others shine a light into one of the darkest corners of human history. They prove that even within a regime built on fear, propaganda, and absolute obedience, there was room, however small, for individual moral choice. Refusal was not without risk. Careers could be damaged, transfers ordered, investigations launched, and in rare cases, imprisonment endured. Yet the overwhelming evidence shows that the deadly consequences so often assumed were far from inevitable. In the moral landscape of Nazi Germany, where the machinery of death depended on the willing compliance of countless individuals, these cases are a stark reminder: orders are not destiny. Men with rank, training, and the means to kill chose instead to resist, using law, bureaucracy, moral conviction, or sheer defiance to shield themselves and sometimes others from complicity in atrocity. Their courage undermines the excuse of, "I had no choice." It reminds us that even under the most oppressive systems, the human spirit can find ways to say no and survive. In remembering them, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. If refusal was possible then, it is possible now. And if conscience could speak even in the shadow of the Third Reich, it can speak anywhere.